Hey, changemaker! Welcome to Rethink Social Change podcast, a show dedicated to helping social change practitioners improve the way they make change happen to achieve tangible and sustained impact. I'm your host, Ratiba Sharif. I've worked with some of the world's leading social change organizations for more than 2 decades on 4 continents to help them design better projects, learn from them, and measure their results. Using Rethink Social Change cards, I will challenge changemakers like yourself to share their experience on what worked, what didn't, and why, in a very unique way. I will shuffle the deck of 54 Rethink Social Change cards and randomly draw 4 cards that will guide our conversation. So if you're ready for unscripted, jargon-free stories from the field, let's dive into today's episode. Thanks for joining me. Really excited to have Florencia Gierzovich on the podcast today. I met her 6 years ago when I helped 3 World Bank governance practice teams revamp their theories of change using the Rethink Social Change cards. So she's quite familiar with them. But let me tell you a little bit about her before I bring her in. Florencia is a political scientist by training who sits where governance, programming, and monitoring, learning, and evaluation meet. She started her career at the Argentinian Anti-Corruption Office in 2000. And since then, she's been at the forefront of innovation, learning, and impact on transparency and accountability initiatives. She worked with many organizations, of which the World Bank and the Open Society Foundation. She's also done research into the very essence of public accountability. More recently, she's been part of a steering groups in Santa Catarina in Brazil, focusing on transparency and citizen empowerment. So she's no stranger to the intricate dance of governance, social accountability, and policy. She also uses her expertise to serve as a real catalyst for change. A few years ago, she co-founded Act for Delivery, driving action for service delivery. Enough said, let's bring her in. Hi, Florencia. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Roger. It's a pleasure to be with you and chat with you a little bit about theories of change and MERL and our work.
Yes, that's what we will talk about. It's early in the morning in Rio. That's where I'm catching you in Rio de Janeiro.
I'm in Florianópolis, which is southern Brazil, but yes, in Brazil.
In Brazil. Okay, cool. Excellent. So you know a little bit about the cards. So I'm going to shuffle them. I'm going to draw 3 cards to get us started. And then I'll draw a card which I won't show you right now, but I may bring it into the conversations later on to help us dig deeper, so to speak. So that's 1 card, and 2 and 3. Let's see what we have. Okay. All right. So we have 3 cards. The first one is a context card. It's the economic context. So it's talking about equity, access, opportunities, economic dynamics, reality. That's what it's talking about. The second card we have is a tools card for change, for social change, and it is the facilitate dialogue. So how are we facilitating dialogue around issues of economic dynamics? Bring people together to engage and share perspective. And the last one is technology as a resource. How are we harnessing technology? What are some of the pros and cons of working with technology to, for example, facilitate dialogue? So you can use the 3 cards, merge them together if you think of a project that you've recently worked on or in your career, or you can speak to each one of them separately, and then we'll try to see if they are interlinked or not.
Sounds good.
So
okay. I think I'll start with facilitation. I think, and I'm going to talk about facilitation on 2 levels, I think. First, I work on a lot of projects that are around bringing together stakeholders usually government and civil society, but also other stakeholders to solve problems or to hold providers and other public servants to account. And I think what we know from that, from the evidence around that work, is that, and also from the tacit knowledge of practitioners, even before there was evidence, is that quality facilitation of those spaces that bring together people is what makes the magic happen, right? From who gets invited, how conversations are structured. And yet it's been really hard in both in our theories of change and in our indicators and in even our narratives about the work to acknowledge that that's what matters, which also makes it very hard to not only assess fairly the work, but also put a budget line for it and pay for that work because we're not used to paying well for that work that makes the magic happens, right? And so so to me, in a lot of the projects that I've been part of, it's been a big challenge to how do we surface that? How do we understand the role that facilitation plays at community level to come up with a shared action plan that will move, but also beyond the community? So we have brokers, let's call it brokers, or system conveners, or orchestrators, catalyzers, and lots of jargon language to talk about these people who are basically the ones that are almost play like a transmission belt between what's learned in the front line. So you have a school, the school gets parent, teachers, and principals to work together and finds a way to get these people that didn't talk with each other to talk with each other and solve problems. It's going to go and take that insight of how that facilitation happens to the regional director, right, of education, to try to explain, well, look, we have this methodology. What bits of it can you take up? And you might be able to mainstream in a larger, you probably can't wholesale take that experience. But how do we take the insight and have a conversation that also needs a facilitator, let's say, right? Or whether it's a national authority, right? Someone that can do that conveying between and help find that adaptation, so that the adaptation can be sustained and scale beyond that initial test that we did, right, with a project. And so, and that might grant conditions of sustainability beyond what a short-term project can bring. And that, may enable innovation and learning from other schools, right? So facilitation also comes in my own work as a monitoring and evaluation person, right? So I often need to think about what is the different stakeholders want out of the investment they can make in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And the questions that are important for those in the front line, whether it be the communities or the providers and the implementers, are different than the ones that the board that it's going to approve the funding wants, because they're making different decisions. They're in different parts of the system, right? And they are all valuable. But so how do we broker a system that gives different people what they need, rather than create a kind of battle of it's my viewpoint or your viewpoint? Because if I can't get the board to approve the funding, the work will have more trouble in the front line. But if I can't listen to the front line, what's approved doesn't make sense on the ground. So how do we facilitate that?
Thanks for those two things. Two ways of looking at facilitation in your work and how you facilitate dialogue. And so if we know who's in the room, it's also important to know who's not in the room. That's also very important. And also becoming what I really liked is that sometimes when you facilitate dialogue, people can't take everything, but you have to negotiate with them what's the part that they are ready to accept to move forward and that they can work on. I really like that. Especially in very complex projects, we sometimes are overwhelmed, and we try to see this as a, that the final outcome is everything is going to be achieved. But sometimes you make progress towards achieving very large scale changes, especially if they require new ways of thinking about possibilities, new ways of doing business, repositioning players and actors. There's a lot of reluctance of changing roles and understanding the limits of your roles and how you can engage others as well. So all of that comes into play. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, of course, as M&E folk, even if you do evaluation, it's about facilitating. It's about facilitating reflection. It's about giving meaning to evidence and showing ways of using that evidence. So, Florencia, we talked a little bit about facilitating dialogue. What do these cards kind of bring out?
Okay, so let's start with the economic context, and I want to talk about the economic context of the work rather than of the economic context of us as consultants and evaluators and facilitators, and also of the fact that we are working with communities whose part of the work is paid for, right? Or public officials, right? And so the first thing is, I would say, at community level, again, a lot of the work that gets funded for encouraging participation, it's voluntary. And so we don't value it because we're not paying for it often, right? And we don't see the value we're getting from those multipliers of mobilization. And I think, in our work as freelancers, as consultants, right? We are often in a sort of similar place, right? Where we are, we do a lot of work that gets paid and well paid often, although there are lots of divergences depending on the market and who hires and for what and where you're based and all kinds of things that affect that. But also we do a lot of work that it's unseen. And a lot of the work we do, I think, especially when we work with multiple organizations, and a lot of the way we learn, which is we learn from, there's proprietary information from each project we work in, but there are lots of things of the trade that one learns from one project to the next. And when one works like I do, often in a broad but loosely connected set of themes, you also gain a lot of substantive information about the system, about the actors, about what happens. And I think one of the challenges that I've faced lately is that the more I work with different portfolios, the more I feel I gain knowledge that should be a public good, right? Rather than a private good, because you see connections between what you're learning in project with organization A and organization B and organization C, right? But the fact that we are freelancers and we're not anchored in an institution, or let alone an American university that can fundraise to do research, to put that knowledge out there, puts it on us to kind of use our free time to blog about these things as a public good, right? Exactly. And that goes to technology. So there's a bit I think of the thinking how our role gets underutilized in terms of facilitating broader knowledge beyond our individual clients, and how we lever some people say, well, it's unfair that you're exactly using technology to blog, to convene webinars, because I'm doing it in my free time with colleagues, right? We also have a lot of networks, right, that connect unusual suspects together. And so technology is great for that. And it's great for sparking out of the box debates. I use social media a lot to do that. At the same time, it's my late nights that go unpaid, so to speak. It's my savviness or not or my ability to call on colleagues that are savvier with technology to learn how to use it. But if I can't call those favors, it doesn't happen. And whereas the system doesn't fund those kinds of conversations and convenings and things. And I think to some extent it's the same in a very different level. It's the same thing that people in the front line experience. They have the know-how, they know their systems, they know the technologies that work for them, which sometimes it's a megaphone around town or going to the church out after the meeting rather than IT when there's no connectivity, right? What is the technology that makes sense to them? But they're doing it on their free time. And so they lose, the communities lose, and we lose because we are not learning about what's happening outside our kind of like small little funded projects. So I think that's a challenge and that I've been trying to navigate in terms of pushing conversations together, of bringing both different theoretical and methodological perspectives, but also bringing different voices to the conversation that have very valuable experience but might not be well networked. Especially if you're in the global south, you don't even know where to start sometimes. Language is a barrier, but I think relationships are the biggest barrier. And I also think culture. When I sit in a meeting full of people from country A, the culture of communication may sound respectful when it's disrespectful for another culture, and vice versa. And so if you're a newcomer in a network of international people that you don't even know and you got invited, how do you navigate that? Right? Again, facilitation, right? But it takes a lot of craft and skill to do that. And so we can't expect people to do that, just because there's only so much mission driven thing we can do, right? People need to pay bills. And so I think that's where the economy kind of like becomes a barrier, right? And of course, institutions in the global north are historically advantaged with resources to do this and convene this and lead on these kinds of conversations. And that has led to skews in what we all benefit from, right?
Yeah. It raises two points that we kind of discussed offline a little bit. It's this idea of whose voice is heard and how it's heard, but it also brings up this idea of the potential that consultants can bring because they see so many systems, so many modus operandi of organizations, and they can see the larger system, but they also can see patterns within those systems, repeating patterns, and that is, as you say, it's the onus is on us to find ways of sharing that knowledge, of kind of putting it together into a comprehensive, logical kind of story, if you will, but also really teasing out some of the lessons learned that have a much larger potential for change, so they can be applied in different organizations. It's a bit the reason why I started this podcast, is to hear those voices. And I'm actually already seeing, from the different guests, there are some emerging themes there from the different conversations, similar, regardless of the guest and their sector of intervention, the country. You still see very similar patterns emerging of ways of doing business, but also approaches, frameworks, and just like perspectives, the lens you have on something. So it'd be interesting to come back. So let's use as many spaces as we can, and just do our bit where we stand, right? You harnessing technology if need be, and using other methods. Another thing that came up while you were talking about the economic, but that's more like the cost of these kind of processes. Facilitating dialogue takes time, and oftentimes it's hard to put a value, because you can enter a facilitation process, a dialogue process, you have no idea where it will lead you. So it takes time, and then it's like, how am I going to show? So agreeing with whoever funds this project, or the main stakeholders, agreeing on what success looks like for a process. And I think that's an interesting one. The word that actually that I drew was process, and that's why it brought it up. And this card is a card to qualify, to invite, I use it in the deck to invite people to think about the process, to have a better sense of the time that is required, the skills that are required, etc., to be able to, say, facilitate a dialogue process. So in this one is this kind of also reminded me of the recent publication that you had. I think you did some work on social accountability and sustained outcome, and relations came in as central, right? And relations is about process, is about engaging people, is about one step forward, two step backwards, one step to the side. So tell me a little bit about the evidence that you found from M&E resources, from experience as well, and what led you to create this rubrics of better understanding. For example, let's just take social accountability. When you start a social accountability intervention, project, whatever you call it, and you want sustained outcomes, what happens in the middle? That black box.
That's great. So the first thing as a way of background, I would say is that I think that along with a series of colleagues, Alex Watterson, Tom Aston, and others, we've been thinking a lot about what does it look like to work, to know that you are on a road towards greater sustainability. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we identified were like 2 or 3 things. One is that it's almost like an unhelpful catch-22, the debate between it's either short-term projects or long-term, like generation-long investments. What we see is that you need more time than one project, but you probably need less than a whole generation to bring a lot of the change that this kinds of projects see. And someone at PACT used a phrase that I really like to explain this, which is you are playing a long-term game with short-term tools or projects or cycles. And so the savviest people that I've seen do this work are doing exactly that. They're playing long-term games with imperfect short-term tools, and they're weaving them over time, right? And when they do that, because there is a transition between piece A and piece B, right? And project A might be with one set of organizations and donors and areas of government, and project B might be with a partly overlapping, but not exactly the same thing. Also, the context in 3-4 years change. What you learned change. You learn some things work, don't work. So in those transitions, part of the weaving is figuring out the compromise, the prioritization, and what new perspectives bring that kind of force you to look at what you've done in a different lens and jiggle it up, right? So when you're doing that, and you come with an M&E lens that only expects to see after project 2, let's say, right? The same thing that you expected at the beginning of project 1, you're cutting yourself short, right? Because you're never going to see that That's not what the process is, and not what a healthy process is that navigates the system, right? If, for example, you started the project and generally the indicators for beyond your project, generally the indicators of quality of health were really low and they improved for a number of reasons over time. I mean, are you going to do the same thing? Probably not, because you already are starting in a different place. If you started your project trying to deal with nutrition issues, right? And you started focusing on schools because at school level, at kindergarten or like preschool, that's where you can deal with things. But on the process, you realize that to work with the school on stunting, you also need to engage, I don't know, the Ministry of Finance, right? And you bring the Ministry of Finance for project 2. I mean, that changes. The Ministry of Finance is going to bring another set of perspectives. It would be not smart not to consider how you're going to accommodate that based on something you learned. So the outcome that I should see in a process, right, over time, that I should expect should be a hybrid. It shouldn't be exactly what I designed on day 0, devoided of all this. So that was one challenge we had. The second challenge we had was, and we were seeing, by the way, we're seeing a lot of evaluations come saying like this project didn't accomplish anything because it didn't do what it said it would do on day 0, right? So but then the other thing is, ideally, and it's great when we have the resources to do a 20-year retrospective evaluation. There are not very many of those. It's also great when you can do an ex post evaluation that you can come, a few years after and see what happens. Also, not many of those. But it also is not as helpful as knowing whether in the process you are seeing hints that you're going in the right direction, even if you're not accomplishing. So are you sitting with the right set of stakeholders? Are you having meaningful conversations where these people are listening to what they're doing and then they're taking it up and making something that you might not even be part of and your brand might not be there, but that would not have happened absent this shared learning? And so the rubric I think we try to do is try to find a way to systematically think about what would the theory of change, the causal pathway, let's call it the causal pathway, would look like, right, if we know that we are moving in the right direction. So that we can say, well, in 6 months, did we manage to get the right set of stakeholders in the table? Did we bring new people that we identified as critical? Are we having meaningful conversations? Did we learn that they, even if they didn't invite us, that they took this to another conversation where there's a possibility that it might be taken up? So how can we systematically give points, let's say, in a monitoring system, right? And reward in an evaluative judgment people that are moving in the right direction, so that they have signals as they go, right? That they're doing what politically makes sense, what causally we have evidence to think that makes sense. And if we realize that our evidence and our assumptions are wrong, we can revisit our assumptions and change who should we be scoring, right? Validate our assumptions, and then, and see where that takes us in terms of surfacing what we hear from people that are working in the projects, that visit the projects, donors that are talking with public officials that have taken up ideas, and that has been obscured by the black box of the project for so long. And so when you do that and teams tell you, I feel seen, or teams tell you, oh my God, yeah, this could be useful for me because my work is not seen and I want it seen and I want to tell my story, it's great. And what we did with Alex is we picked a series of existing evaluations of projects, and we tried to see, look, in an ideal world, you would go and collect data. right? But we don't work in an ideal world, so we didn't have money to go collect data, economics. So we picked a portfolio of projects that actually had evaluations, and we put criteria for the sample that had to do with how many pieces of evidence we had, so that we had enough pieces to triangulate imperfect data. And we retrofitted into the rubric, would we be able to capture things that otherwise were not salient in the conversation? And how far did the project go? Is this rubric fair to capture 3-year projects of less than $1 million? And we found a very interesting perspective of how far the projects have moved in the right direction that is more consistent with what happened with some of these projects after they finished. And then Alex took that's in the paper. And then Alex took, after the paper was written like 2 years ago, another set of the same portfolio, a new batch of evaluations, and redid it again. And so validated the rubric again with a whole new set of projects. So we think that there's a lot of promise for thinking this way in social accountability, but we also had reviewers that work with other evidence uptake areas, and they thought, well, this is also helpful to try to adapt to other chains that require this information sharing, perspective sharing, and uptake beyond what we've been traditionally able to show that our value addition is to the system. So I'm quite excited about ways to continue experimenting and using this tool.
Yeah, and Florencia, I mean, this is fantastic, and it's really it's trying to to do the best with imperfect, or it's not collected that you've collected. It's not data that you've collected at a given time. It's just a collection, and probably the fact that you validated it, or Alex validated it 2 years later, actually was much more of a proof of the solidity of that of the rubric. When I looked at your document, I skimmed through it, and the rubrics are really. It reminded me of progress markers from the outcome mapping community, where it kind of reminded me that you did put names to them, though, and a very clear scoring system, which I think is very good as well, because but really it's new ways of, it's new indicators. So basically we're moving we're reframing indicators to be more, to show evidence, to be more realistic about what it is that we're trying to see. So it's not project indicators that are very short-termist, outputty, kind of bean counting type things, but it's more about, how we making progress towards change, and how we identify that change at milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3, and the estimated time that it takes to reach that kind of milestone based on previous projects. So tell me about it. I see that you're...
I think that's it. I think there's 2 other values that I see from rubrics, and I mean, there are people that know a lot more about rubrics than me, but it's one, it's making transparent how we are evaluating things. Because how many times have you come across an evaluation and you are like, well, but that evaluative judgment doesn't make any sense, or it's unfair, right? And it's because there's not openness about what is our evaluative judgment based on. If you have a rubric, it's very clear what is about. And we are working on projects where there's a lot of staff rotation. So what people and staff rotation in the different organizations involved, right? So what the new person comes in, they don't know what was the agreement down there, right? And so a lot of this, it's not because of bad faith. It's just kind of like a broken telephone, right? Where like you don't know what you're being assessed on because you don't have that institutional memory. So I think one thing, it's about the transparency and fair, and the shared fairness, of feeling of fairness, which contributes to the ownership in using this information or not, which ultimately I don't want an evaluation to stay in a drawer. I want people to use it, so they need to own it. Now, the other thing that I think it's quite critical with the rubrics is that, or that for me was very helpful. So this was for a World Bank project, World Bank portfolio. The World Bank has log frames, and I was able to, with a rubric, you can quantify, because I can say, this is the label for step 1. This is the label for step 2 in the causal pathway. And step 1 gets a 0, and step 2 gets a 25, and step 3 gets a 50. So in the log frame, I can put a number. And so I can I can use quant indicators for those that need it. But that doesn't mean that I'm bean counting for those that need the other information. And again, facilitation, right? So how do you come up with an approach that gives different people what they need, instead of having, the people that need rich data and say this is complex, just frustrated with the bean counters, and the bean counters too frustrated with the very complicated kind of language and convoluted language. So translation, right? And facilitation. So the rubric, I think our rubric tried to do that. Other rubrics don't need to do that. They just use one or the other. Ours needed to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And I also think that, it creates those conversations, that dialogue that you facilitate, on those conversations on what it is what evidence do we need? What is it we're after? What are the pathways to change that we're after as well? By when can we reach them? How will we? Because as always, the pathways to change, you need almost like plan A's and plan B's. You think that things will never remain equal. We're in a kind of emergent, very dynamic context all the time, especially on governance projects in different countries. So it really also opens the opportunity, something that's really dear to me, which is I want everyone to think like an evaluator, including program staff. So in other words, you provide them with the questions they need to ask themselves.
Yes.
That you as an evaluator will ask yourself. But as they implement their project, they deploy them, they also learn to read the cues, understanding what's going on, test some of their assumptions. What do you do when you realize that in community X or community X, Y, and Z, your assumptions are a little flawed? You didn't quite read the context as it happens to be now that you're there, because you can read a context. Once the intervention comes in, the activities comes in, everyone interacts with them in a very different way. So hence the complexity. And so you realize that local authority A has decided that now it's going to use the project or use the activities for other agendas, etc. So what do you do then? And that's kind of sometimes what stalls progress towards your own outcomes, project outcomes, but it might open up avenues for seeing the larger picture and looking at others' expected outcomes, other stakeholders that are important for you to take forward your activities and sustain sometimes your activities as well beyond your project.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely on point on that. I always say the most important skill set for doing M&E is like, are you open to challenge your assumptions and understand under which conditions they hold or not, right? Rather than just try to defend them like no matter what. I do think I've had teams that when you present them to this different picture, I think the first reaction is well, there's a reaction of I hadn't thought about that. But there's also the reaction of, really? Do you care about this? Anyone cares about this? Should we be talking about this? I lost sleep over this, but I didn't think anyone would care about it. Or I thought that my management will come punish me if I didn't come fully certain about what was the right answer. And so I think it completely opens a new revalorization of those kind of frontline stakeholders that at whatever level they are working, right, are grappling and losing sleep over their bets, right, and don't feel that that's an okay part of the story to tell. I think it opens up the space for pause and reflection amongst people that are working at the same level, where it be world bankers sharing knowledge with other project managers or task team leaders about how to sell something or negotiate something with a country rep or a country government, or whether it is like people at the working in schools, as I was saying, trying to figure out what's the best way to structure and sequence conversations between parents and teachers and directors with massive asymmetries of power. And so I think the key there is figuring out who has something to talk with whom about in a safe space, because often, because we're not used to talking about this, we're very afraid of talking about this. So how do we, or what do I do if I have a government that I don't ideologically agree with, but there's an open opportunity to work with? Do I go for it? Do I not go for it? So I think these are dilemmas that a lot of people are facing in different parts of the world. And these are key assumptions they're making every day on decisions that have effects over the staff of their organizations, whether they get paid, who they hire. Do I hire lawyers or do I hire kind of like facilitators? It's a different story. So depending on what path I choose, right? And so I think that it opens up a whole new set of conversations if you sort of like use these tools to unpack the kinds of assumptions that you were discussing, for individuals to get better at their job, also to lose fear about what they're doing, and for us collectively to produce this public good of knowledge and of storytelling, of telling the right story of what's happening, being fair to that.
Storytelling tends to become like more of a PR exercise now than a real, genuine, authentic, appreciation of what is, which doesn't undermine the efforts that one made or the good intentions or the sound research that went behind developing a new project, designing a new project. With is just the cards that you have in hand at that point in time tell you that you can do this, and as your project unfolds naturally in organic environments, actors will change, stakes will change, interests will change, positions of people will change, etc. So that's it's an important, I think, point we have to, or important for us to keep on holding that space and making sure that we still have those conversations within organizations. I think there's a lot of lip service being paid to learning. We've seen a whole slew of like the MEL, the MEL and the MERLs and all of those acronyms come up. A lot of learning. A week ago, there was a presentation here in Morocco, actually, World Bank learning agenda on and again, there are some organizations that it's important to sit with them and see, what do you mean by learning, and what do you learn on? Do you need a longitudinal study, an evaluation? Is that how you learn, or do you have tools, systems, and opportunities for staff and partners to share learning on the ground, like real learning with the reality of that we face, without cynicism or even disillusionment, but just learning. It's that sitting with truth.
Yeah, because I
What
think
would-
I think also it's about the, I mean, I know, it's been very, very fashionable to talk about learning from failure and so on. But I think
Mm,
it's also, I mean, I work on problems that are sometimes seem intractable. They're very complicated, convoluted,
mhm,
depend on tons of people. They're not
yes.
easy to solve by any stretch of the imagination. So,
Mm,
so you have to be prepared for disappointment. Disappointment is part of the work, you know.
mm,
And so, to me, how you resignify disappointment uh, as a human resource problem, almost, right? Like, your volunteers and your staff get disappointed all the time. If
mm,
your expectations are marketing expectations, you often are further or are so unrealistic, right? That further feed the disappointment. To some extent, you're also reinforcing people stop doing the work, leaving, and staff rotation. So you have a human resource problem by design because of the nature of the tensions between the marketing, if you would, and the
mm,
unrealistic expectations and the work of the people that do. These are not business of buying stuff. They're business of people and relationships. And
yeah.
so it's almost like your core investment, which is the social capital that you invest on by paying people and engaging volunteers, is your number one asset. And
Mm,
so what I worry about sometimes, in terms of like why the first thing that drew me to learning, really, I'm not a learning person, I'm a political scientist, if one would, had to do with
mm,
that, had to do with seeing, I mean, I was working on anti-corruption for all
mhm,
things. And I mean, it's like, it requires, there's a moment where like being mission driven, it's not enough, right?
mm,
And so if you're not valuing what those individuals are learning, what you're learning, to resignify that externally imposed failure, right?
mm,
You're losing your main capital, which is the institutional memory and the networks and that these individuals bring to the table. And
mhm,
so to me, there's almost a managerial aspect to this story for whoever
mm,
considers an organization in terms of why I would invest in learning, if you would. But there's also
mm,
for donors who care about fields, right?
mhm,
There's an issue around the kind of the we talk about field health or ecosystem strength, or right. And it's like, if we don't start looking at the people and those networks, right, and
mm,
what they are getting on that allows whatever flame of mission drivenness allows them to continue doing a work that it's perennially disappointing compared to externally
mm,
imposed expectations, we are undermining the resilience of the system. I don't think we think often
mm,
as that, but I think that
mm,
it is, to me, it's been a key part of the story of like why it's worth doing this, why it's worth kind of investing in learning. And
mm,
sometimes the client gets it, and great,
mm,
brilliant. Sometimes the client doesn't get it, and I'm not going to lose time in kind of like, and that's what I do a lot in my external time, like trying to
mm,
put the pieces together. But and that's the challenge, it's like it's
mm,
frustrating, but yeah, I do think that there's a part of this that it's around. I'm a firm believer in learning and in social learning, in what we learn with others that we don't normally speak with.
mm, yeah.
And it's hard to see, when you get a call for proposals, and you're considering like, should I work with this person, should I bid for this, you're like, is this person serious, is this person not serious, like, is it worth my time, is it not worth my time?
Mm,
Because like you
mm,
say, it becomes fashionable and you don't know, right, what's behind.
mm,
So
yeah.
you take
And
risks.
also, yeah, it's really difficult to navigate because the client is not a monolith. Sometimes you have people working within client organizations or just organizations who do adhere and have that kind of same vision, the systems around them, the way the project or programs are structured, the way they fall within a country program strategy. There's also kind of bidding war, right? Turf wars is within organizations,
Yes.
and governance being almost a transversal. For example, if you took the example of governance or people working on gender mainstreaming, see that as well. When you're working on transversal, it's very difficult to deal with or link the silos and show them how everything is interconnected and the learning happens as a group, right? But I think, Florencia, it's also a question of intention.
Yes.
The organization, they say, they want learning. Do they put the systems in place? Do they allow staff the time, the space? You need time and space to think about a project, to reflect on it. It can be guided or not, but do they have mechanisms where they can bring up those emerging lessons from the field that are almost like little whistleblowers saying, oops, we're not going the right way? For example, one key stakeholder that we're working with is actually taking the project in another directions, and we risk our reputation as an organization. How do we engage them and facilitate so we don't alienate them? Because we need them, they're in this community and they're a key kind of pivot stakeholder. And how do we stay true to our mission? There's so many elements or concepts or constructs that come into play that it's hard to really put the finger on something. But I think with intentional learning and, authentic learning, because is the way for organizations, and it will take time for people to understand that. It will actually take so many large programs, complex programs where we see, okay, we're not seeing the evidence that we anticipated. The evaluations are not showing us more than anecdotal evidence of success. So what are we doing wrong? So that kind of questioning moment will come up, hopefully, in time. And we still have to keep on engaging in those conversations with them.
I think it's almost like the logic of the rubric that I just was discussing. So a lot of the real learning in a lot of these big organizations that I've worked with, right? It's driven by, let's call it like a lot of mission driven people that are working in systems that are not set up to do exactly what they want, right? So if you're, and so to some extent, what you need to see is this kind of non-linear way of creating detours within the system. Like I said, I create a rubric, and the rubric gives a quantity to a log frame in the World Bank, but it allows me to bring another layer of knowledge that just a quantity indicator that was just counting beans wouldn't, right? So is it like, if you look at the reporting system of the World Bank, right? Is this meaningful enough to say the World Bank is moving to change? No, because I had zero power to change how the World Bank does M&E, at a corporate level or even at practice level. Now, the question is, can you sort of like, at what point do you think that there's enough space in that compromise to create a building block that either within the World Bank or outside the World Bank might allow me to continue pushing this agenda of learning, even if the World Bank makes a sharp turn and says, no, let's count beans again. And so what I see, it's like, for some time, this allowed me to have conversations with stakeholders of the program, and that was useful. But even now, I'm at the moment, I'm not consulting with the bank. I can still use the knowledge to talk with the tool to talk with other organizations that were or not engaged in that process that have a similar problem. And so it goes back again to this kind of playing the long-term game of changing the organizational culture with short-term, real, concrete tools so that we walk the talk. I think that, and I think a lot of the people that are honestly pushing learning within this massive, very complex organizations, kind of have this spirit of like, I'll put a layer and tomorrow I'll put another layer and then we will start walking up, right? So
It's a marathon. It's not a sprint race, right?
exactly. Sometimes it's a relay race because sometimes you need to hand the baton to someone else, and that's okay. It's not about you being we're going for systemic change. Not single actor can pull it off on their own.
Yeah. Well, Florencia, I think this is the perfect place. Closing words to close this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. I loved our conversation. We should do more of these and and share more and invite more people to join. I think there are people all over the world who think similarly, and we need just to find each other, I guess.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this podcast because I think it's going to be, I hope, yeah, as you say, I've heard a bunch of them and they're all like very thoughtful. And I think they're a great way to use technology to showcase and connect different people that might otherwise not come across. So thank you for the invitation and looking forward to more.
Likewise. Thanks a lot, Florencia. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rethink's Social Change podcast. I hope you got a lot of value and actionable insights from today's show. Would love if you take a minute to leave us a review. And if you work on social change and are up for the challenge, reach out. And before you go, be sure to subscribe so you're the first to know when we release a new episode. Till then, be the change.